The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Princess Charlotte stood near the window of her private study, her small hands clasped together as she watched the guards changing their positions in the courtyard below. At just 9 years old, she had already learned that life inside palace walls was far more complicated than the fairy tales suggested. Charlotte had been quieter than usual these past few weeks. Her mother, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had noticed the change in her daughter's demeanor. The young princess who once filled the halls with laughter and endless questions had become withdrawn, spending more time alone in her room with her thoughts. Catherine had tried to gently probe what was troubling her daughter, but Charlotte would only offer a weak smile and insist that everything was fine. But everything was not fine. Charlotte had stumbled upon something that had shaken her understanding of her family and the institution she was born into. It had started innocently enough, 3 weeks earlier, when she had been looking for her favorite book in the library. The palace library was enormous, filled with thousands of books from floor to ceiling, and Charlotte loved getting lost among the shelves. That particular afternoon, she had wandered into a section she rarely visited, searching for a book about horses that her father had mentioned. As she rounded a corner near the back of the library, she heard voices, low, hushed voices that carried a tone of urgency and secrecy. Charlotte froze, her hand still reaching for a book on the shelf. And the voices were coming from a small reading alcove just beyond the bookshelf where she stood. She recognized one of the voices immediately. It belonged to her step-grandmother, Queen Camilla. Charlotte knew she should announce her presence or simply walk away, but something in the tone of the conversation made her pause. She pressed herself against the bookshelf, her heart beginning to race. The other voice belonged to a woman Charlotte didn't recognize, someone who spoke with a crisp, efficient tone that suggested she was used to handling delicate matters. "The photographs must never surface," Camilla was saying, her voice tight with tension. "I don't care what it costs. Pay her whatever she wants, but make this disappear. If the press gets hold of these, it will undo everything we've worked for." The other woman responded, "Ma'am, I must advise you that the amount she's demanding is substantial, and there's no guarantee she won't come back for more. These situations rarely end with a single payment." Charlotte heard the sound of footsteps, as if Camilla was pacing. "Then we need to ensure she understands the consequences of crossing the royal family. There are ways to apply pressure without being obvious about it. Use your contacts. Find something we can use against her if she becomes difficult." The young princess felt her stomach turn. She didn't understand everything being discussed, but she understood enough to know that something wrong was happening. Her step-grandmother, who always smiled warmly at official events and spoke about duty and service, was talking about hiding something and threatening someone. "No, what about the Princess of Wales?" the other woman asked. "She's been asking questions about the charitable foundation's accounts. If she digs deeper..." "Catherine is too focused on her children and her public duties to go digging through old records," Camilla interrupted. "But we need to be careful. Move the questionable transactions to the offshore accounts. Make sure the paper trail goes cold. And for heaven's sake, keep this away from William. He's already suspicious about the changes we've made to the trust funds." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. They were talking about her mother, about her father, about hiding money and covering up secrets. She wanted to run, to get away from what she was hearing, but her legs felt frozen in place. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Camilla giving instructions about various matters that needed to be handled discreetly. There was talk of manipulating press coverage, of planting favorable stories while suppressing others, of using palace resources for personal matters while disguising them as official business. Each revelation felt like another weight pressing down on Charlotte's small shoulders. Finally, she heard the two women preparing to leave. Charlotte quickly but quietly moved away from the bookshelf, slipping deeper into the library's labyrinth of shelves. She found a hiding spot behind a large globe and waited, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it could be heard throughout the entire library. She watched through the shelves as Camilla and the other woman emerged from the alcove and walked toward the library's main entrance, and their conversation now shifted to mundane matters about the upcoming state dinner. After they left, Charlotte remained hidden for several more minutes, trying to process what she had heard. Her mind raced with questions. What photographs was Camilla trying to hide? Why was she worried about her mother finding things in charitable accounts? What had they done to the trust funds that would make her father suspicious? Charlotte had always been taught about honesty and integrity. Her parents had raised her to understand the importance of truth and doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. But what she had just overheard suggested that not everyone in her family lived by those same principles. It was a disillusioning revelation for a 9-year-old who had grown up believing that royalty meant nobility in every sense of the word. But that evening at dinner, Charlotte found it difficult to act normally. She picked at her food, barely responding to her younger brother Louis's silly jokes or her older brother George's attempts to engage her in conversation about their upcoming holiday plans. Her mother noticed her distraction and gently asked if she was feeling well. Charlotte nodded and managed a smile, but inside she felt torn apart by the secret she now carried. Over the following weeks, Charlotte became hyper-aware of everything happening around her. She noticed things she had never paid attention to before. She saw how Camilla commanded the staff with an authority that seemed to go beyond her official role. She observed the way certain advisors would defer to Camilla on matters that Charlotte thought should have involved her father or grandfather. She noticed the subtle tensions that existed beneath the surface of family gatherings, the careful way her mother would phrase certain questions, and the quick glances exchanged between palace officials when sensitive topics arose. Charlotte also began to notice a particular royal guard who seemed different from the others. His name was Officer James Thornton, and he had been part of the palace security detail for over 15 years. Unlike many of the guards who maintained a strict, emotionless demeanor, Officer Thornton had kind eyes and would occasionally offer Charlotte a slight smile when they passed in the corridors. He had been present on the day she overheard the conversation in the library, stationed near the library entrance as part of his regular duties. One afternoon, Charlotte was walking through the palace gardens, seeking solace among the roses and hedgerows that provided a temporary escape from the oppressive weight of her knowledge. Officer Thornton was on garden patrol, maintaining a respectful distance but ensuring the young princess remained safe. Charlotte found herself drawn to a bench beneath an old oak tree, the same bench where her grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, used to sit. As she sat there, lost in thought, Officer Thornton approached respectfully. "Excuse me, Your Royal Highness," he said gently. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to ensure you're quite all right. You seem troubled, if you don't mind my saying so." Charlotte looked up at him, surprised by his direct approach. Most of the guards never spoke to her unless absolutely necessary. She saw genuine concern in his eyes, and in something else, a kind of knowing that made her wonder if he understood more than he was supposed to. "I'm fine, thank you," Charlotte replied automatically, the response she had been trained to give since she was old enough to speak in public. Officer Thornton nodded but didn't move away. After a moment of hesitation, he spoke again, his voice low and careful. "Your Royal Highness, I've served this family for a long time, long enough to know when something isn't right, and long enough to recognize when someone is carrying a burden too heavy for them to bear alone." Charlotte felt her eyes begin to sting with tears she had been holding back for weeks. She blinked rapidly, trying to maintain her composure. "Do you ever see things?" she asked quietly. "Oh, that make you question everything you thought you knew?" Officer Thornton was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, Your Royal Highness. More often than you might think. The palace is a place of great tradition and ceremony. but it is also a place where human nature reveals itself in all its complexity. Not everything that happens here aligns with the image presented to the public. Charlotte looked at him directly now, her young face serious beyond her years. If you knew something was wrong, something that involved important people, what would you do? The guard met her gaze steadily. That would depend on the nature of the wrong, Your Royal Highness. But I believe that truth and integrity must ultimately prevail, regardless of the cost. The question is always about timing and approach. Sometimes revealing the truth immediately causes more harm than good. Sometimes it's necessary to gather more information, to understand the full scope of a situation before taking action. Charlotte absorbed his words, feeling both comforted and frustrated. She wanted to tell him everything she had heard, to share the burden with someone who might understand and know what to do. But years of training in discretion and the awareness of her position held her back. Instead, she asked, "Have you ever heard things you weren't supposed to hear?" Officer Thornton's expression remained neutral, but Charlotte saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. In 15 years of service, Your Royal Highness, one inevitably becomes privy to information not intended for one's ears. The key is knowing what to do with that information. The wrong action at the wrong time can have consequences far beyond what one might imagine. But doing nothing can also have consequences, Charlotte countered, her voice stronger now. Indeed it can, Officer Thornton agreed, which is why wisdom lies not in choosing between action and inaction, but in choosing the right action at the right time. He paused, then added carefully, "If someone were to possess information that could affect the well-being of people they cared about, I would advise them to trust carefully chosen allies. Not everyone who wears a crown or bears a title has the family's best interests at heart, but there are still those who do, and finding them is crucial." Charlotte understood that Officer Thornton was telling her something important without directly stating it, and he was suggesting that she wasn't alone in her awareness of problems within the palace walls. He was indicating that there were people who could be trusted, even if identifying them required patience and careful observation. As the weeks passed, Charlotte began to pay closer attention to the dynamics between different members of the household staff and family. She noticed that Officer Thornton often seemed to be positioned where important conversations might take place. She observed that he had a network of quiet communication with certain other guards and staff members, people who seemed to share an unspoken understanding about the true nature of palace operations. Charlotte also became more observant of her step-grandmother's activities. She noticed patterns in Camilla's schedule, the people she met with privately, and the way certain meetings were kept off official calendars. She saw how documents would disappear from offices, how certain members of staff would be suddenly reassigned or dismissed, always with official explanations that seemed just a bit too convenient. The young princess began to keep a journal, carefully hidden in her room, where she recorded her observations. She didn't write anything explicit or accusatory, but rather noted dates, times, and vague descriptions of events that seemed significant. She had inherited her great-grandmother's sharp mind and her mother's attention to detail, and she put both to use in documenting the shadows she was beginning to perceive. One particularly revealing moment came during a family gathering for her grandfather's birthday. Charlotte was seated at the children's table, as was customary, but positioned where she could observe the adult conversations. She watched as Camilla skillfully directed discussions, steering conversations away from certain topics while emphasizing others. She saw how her father, Prince William, would occasionally tense during these redirections, as if aware of the manipulation but uncertain how to address it without causing a family confrontation. Charlotte also noticed her mother's careful diplomacy, the way Catherine would phrase questions that seemed innocent but were clearly designed to gather information. She saw the subtle power struggle happening beneath the surface of polite family interaction, and she realized that her mother already suspected something was wrong. And the difference was that Catherine had to navigate the situation with the constraints of her position and the need to protect her family. The weight of Charlotte's knowledge grew heavier with each passing day. She was 9 years old, carrying secrets that would shock the nation if they became public. She understood enough to know that what she had discovered could damage the monarchy itself, but she also understood that staying silent meant allowing wrongdoing to continue unchecked. Late one evening, as Charlotte prepared for bed, her mother came to her room for their usual good-night ritual. Catherine sat on the edge of Charlotte's bed, gently brushing her daughter's hair from her face. "You've been so quiet lately, my darling," she said softly. "I know something is troubling you. You can tell me anything, you know, anything at all." Charlotte looked into her mother's eyes and saw the same struggle she felt within herself, the desire to speak truth balanced against the awareness of consequences. In that moment, she made a decision. Not to reveal everything, not yet, but to begin building a bridge of trust that would allow the truth to emerge when the time was right. "Mama," Charlotte said quietly, "do you think it's possible for good people to do bad things if they think they have good reasons?" Catherine considered the question carefully. "I think people are complicated, Charlotte. Sometimes people convince themselves that questionable actions are justified by their intended outcomes, but ultimately the ends don't justify the means. Yet truth and integrity must be maintained even when it's difficult." "What if someone knew about bad things happening but wasn't sure how to stop them?" Charlotte asked. Her mother's expression became more serious. "Then that person should find someone they trust completely and ask for help. No one should have to carry that kind of burden alone, especially not someone as young as you." Charlotte nodded slowly, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between mother and daughter. Catherine realized that her daughter had discovered something significant, and Charlotte understood that her mother was already aware that something was wrong within the palace walls. They were allies, though neither said so explicitly. The question now was how and when to act on the knowledge they possessed. As Catherine kissed her daughter goodnight and left the room, Charlotte lay in the darkness, her mind racing. She thought about Officer Thornton's words about timing and approach. She thought about the journal she was keeping and the pattern of evidence she was slowly building. She thought about her family, not just her immediate family, but the institution of the monarchy itself, and what her responsibility to both might require of her. Outside her window, she could see Officer Thornton on his patrol, making his rounds through the palace grounds. She wondered what he knew, what he had seen in his 15 years of service. She wondered if he too was waiting for the right moment, gathering his own evidence, preparing for a time when the truth could no longer be suppressed. Charlotte didn't know it yet. But she was about to become part of something much larger than she imagined. The information she possessed, combined with what others were quietly documenting, would eventually form a picture of corruption and manipulation that reached into the highest levels of the royal household. But for now, she was simply a 9-year-old girl trying to do the right thing, in a world where the right thing wasn't always clear. The palace settled into its nighttime quiet, its grand halls and hidden corridors holding secrets both old and new. And in her small room, Princess Charlotte closed her eyes, knowing that sleep would be difficult to find. Tomorrow would bring new observations, new questions, and perhaps new answers. The truth was out there, waiting to be revealed, and somehow she had become one of its guardians. The autumn rain fell steadily against the windows of Kensington Palace, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the tense atmosphere that had settled over the royal household. 3 months had passed since Charlotte first overheard the disturbing conversation in the library, and in that time, she had become an unexpected player in a dangerous game of palace politics and hidden agendas. Charlotte had continued her careful observations, adding to her hidden journal with the dedication of someone far older than her years. What had started as simple notes about suspicious meetings and odd timing had evolved into a detailed record of patterns she was beginning to recognize. She noticed that certain financial advisors visited Camilla's office regularly, always late in the afternoon when most of the staff had gone home. She observed that specific newspaper reporters seemed to have unusual access to palace information, writing stories that aligned perfectly with narratives Camilla wanted promoted. Officer Thornton had become an unexpected ally, though their interactions remained carefully professional on the surface. They had developed a subtle system of communication. When he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, it meant everything was safe. When his right hand rested on his belt, it signaled that Charlotte should be cautious about who might be listening. When he adjusted his collar, it meant something significant was happening that she should pay attention to. One particularly cold October morning, Charlotte was having breakfast with her family in the smaller dining room when her father received an urgent phone call. Prince William's face darkened as he listened, his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. After ending the call, he excused himself abruptly, leaving his coffee untouched. Catherine exchanged a knowing look with Charlotte before following her husband out of the room. Charlotte found herself alone with her brothers, who were too engrossed in their own conversations to notice the tension. She quickly finished her breakfast and excused herself, following the direction her parents had gone. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but her instincts told her that whatever had upset her father was connected to the web of secrets she had been uncovering. She found her parents in her father's private study, their voices raised in a way Charlotte rarely heard. She pressed herself against the wall outside the partially open door, her heart racing. "This is the third time, Catherine," William was saying, his voice shaking with frustration. "The third time that donations meant for the children's hospital have been redirected without proper authorization. And every time I try to investigate, the records mysteriously become unavailable, or I'm told that the changes were approved through proper channels. But when I ask to see those approvals, they can't produce them." Catherine's voice was calmer but equally troubled. "I've been tracking the charitable foundation accounts for months, William. The irregularities aren't limited to the Children's Hospital Fund. There are at least 6 different charities where money has been moved, redirected, or simply disappeared. And every single discrepancy leads back to people appointed by Camilla." "My father won't listen," William said bitterly. "Every time I try to raise these concerns with him, he dismisses them as administrative confusion or suggests I'm being paranoid. He's completely under her influence. She's isolated him from anyone who might question her authority." Charlotte heard her mother sigh. "We need proof, William. Real, documented proof that can't be dismissed or explained away. Otherwise, we're just making accusations against the Queen Consort, and you know how that will look. The press will paint us as the troublemakers trying to undermine her position." "I know," William replied. "But how do we get that proof when she controls access to so many of the records? Her people are embedded throughout the household staff. Anyone who questions too loudly either gets reassigned or finds themselves suddenly retired." Charlotte's mind was racing. She had proof. Not everything, but pieces of it. Her journal contained dates and observations that might help her parents connect the dots. But revealing what she knew would mean admitting that she had been spying, that she had kept secrets from them for months. It would mean exposing herself to potential danger if the wrong people found out what she knew. Before she could decide what to do, she heard footsteps approaching from down the corridor. She quickly moved away from the study door, pretending to be walking past on her way to another part of the palace. The person approaching turned out to be one of Camilla's private secretaries, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who had always made Charlotte uncomfortable with her cold, calculating gaze. "Your Royal Highness," Mrs. Pemberton said with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Shouldn't you be with your tutors at this hour?" "I was just on my way," Charlotte replied, keeping her voice steady despite her nervousness. Mrs. Pemberton's eyes flickered toward the study where Charlotte's parents were still talking, then back to Charlotte. One should be careful about wandering the corridors during private conversations, she said meaningfully. Walls have ears, as they say, and sometimes people hear things that could be misunderstood or cause unnecessary trouble. The thinly veiled threat sent a chill down Charlotte's spine, but she maintained her composure. "I'll remember that, Mrs. Pemberton. Thank you for your concern." As Charlotte walked away, she could feel Mrs. Pemberton's eyes boring into her back. She realized with growing certainty that she wasn't as invisible as she had thought, and someone had noticed her increased attention to palace operations. Someone was watching her just as she had been watching them. That afternoon, Charlotte found Officer Thornton during his usual patrol of the East Wing. She approached him as if simply asking about her upcoming schedule, a conversation that would seem innocent to any observers. "Officer Thornton," she said clearly, for anyone who might be listening, "my mother wanted me to confirm the security arrangements for our visit to the museum next week." Thornton understood immediately that this was a cover for something else. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. Perhaps we should review the details in the security office where I have the complete schedule." The security office was one of the few places in the palace where conversations weren't monitored as closely. It was an unspoken understanding among the guards that their own space remained private. Once they were safely inside with the door closed, Thornton's professional demeanor relaxed slightly. "What's happened?" he asked quietly. Charlotte told him about Mrs. Pemberton's warning and her growing sense that her activities hadn't gone as unnoticed as she had hoped. She also shared what she had overheard between her parents, their frustration at being blocked from investigating the financial irregularities. Thornton listened carefully, his expression grave. "Your Royal Highness, I think it's time you knew that you're not the only one who's been paying attention. There's a small group of us, guards, staff members, people who've served the family loyally for years, who've been documenting concerns about the current situation, and we've seen things that trouble us deeply." He pulled out a simple notebook from a locked drawer in his desk. "We've been recording incidents just as you have, conversations overheard, documents that mysteriously went missing, staff members who were dismissed for asking uncomfortable questions. Separately, these things might seem insignificant, but together, they paint a very disturbing picture." Charlotte felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that she wasn't alone in her awareness, but fear at the implications of what Thornton was suggesting. "What kind of picture?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "A picture of systematic manipulation and corruption," Thornton said bluntly. "The Queen Consort has been consolidating power since the moment she assumed her role. She's placed her own people in key positions throughout the household, removed or sidelined anyone who might question her authority, and created a network that allows her to control information flowing to and from His Majesty, the King. Your father and mother have sensed it, but they can't prove it because the evidence is being hidden or destroyed." "But why?" Charlotte asked. "What does she gain from all this?" Thornton considered his answer carefully. "Power, Your Royal Highness, and money. We believe she's been siphoning funds from various royal charities, using her position to enrich herself and her family while maintaining the appearance of dedicated service. And the photographs she mentioned in that conversation you overheard, we believe those relate to her past connections with individuals who made their fortunes through questionable means. If those connections became public, they would seriously damage both her reputation and the monarchy's credibility." Charlotte felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. "What can we do? If she has so much control, how can we stop her?" "Carefully and methodically," Thornton replied. "Your parents are right that we need undeniable proof. What you've observed, what I and my colleagues have documented, it's all valuable, but it needs to be brought together and presented in a way that can't be ignored or suppressed. The challenge is doing this without alerting Mrs. Pemberton and the others who serve the Queen Consort. If they realize how much we know, they'll move to protect themselves. and evidence will disappear even faster than it already has. Over the following weeks, Charlotte found herself part of a careful conspiracy, though that word seemed too dark for what was really an effort to protect the integrity of the institution she had been born into. Officer Thornton introduced her to two other staff members who were part of their quiet resistance. Margaret Henley, a longtime housekeeper who had served the royal family for 30 years, and David Chen, an accountant who worked in the royal household's financial offices. They met in Margaret's small apartment in the staff quarters, a location that seemed unlikely to draw attention. Margaret had a grandmother's warmth that immediately put Charlotte at ease, while David had a precise, analytical mind that reminded Charlotte of her father. "We've been tracking the financial irregularities for over a year," David explained, spreading out carefully organized papers on Margaret's small dining table. "The amounts aren't huge individually. That would be too obvious. But over time, we're talking about millions of pounds that have been redirected from charitable purposes to accounts we can't fully trace. The Queen Consort's signature appears on authorizations for many of these transfers, but always through intermediaries who swear she approved them verbally." Margaret added, "And anyone who questions these transfers finds themselves suddenly facing performance reviews or being reassigned to positions where they can't access the relevant information. I've seen 3 people from the Household Accounts Office moved or retired in the past year alone, all shortly after they started asking questions." Charlotte shared what she had observed and recorded in her journal. The adults were impressed by her attention to detail and the connections she had drawn between different events. David particularly noted how her observations about meeting schedules aligned with financial transfers in ways that suggested coordination. "Your Royal Highness," David said seriously, "what you've documented here could be crucial. You've recorded meetings and conversations that we had no visibility into. Combined with the financial data I've been collecting and the testimony Margaret and James can provide about suspicious activities, we might actually have enough to build a case. But we can't just dump this information on Prince William," Margaret cautioned. "It needs to be organized, verified, and presented in a way that makes the pattern undeniable. And we need to be prepared for the backlash. The Queen Consort won't go quietly if she's confronted with this." Charlotte had been thinking about this problem. "My mother has been investigating too," she said. "She's been trying to track the charitable foundation accounts. What if we could help her without her knowing where the help was coming from? If she discovers the evidence herself, it would be more credible than if we just handed it to her." The adults exchanged glances, considering this approach. "That's actually quite brilliant," David said. "If the Princess of Wales uncovers this through her own investigation, and no one can accuse her of relying on palace gossip or conspiracy theories, but we would need to be very subtle about directing her to the right information." They began to develop a plan. David would create anonymous summaries of financial irregularities and ensure they ended up in reports that Catherine would naturally review as part of her charitable work. Margaret would make subtle comments to other staff members, knowing that palace gossip traveled in predictable patterns that would eventually reach Catherine's ears. Officer Thornton would position himself to provide security for events where Charlotte's mother might encounter people with information about Camilla's activities. Charlotte's role was perhaps the most delicate. She was to continue her observations, but also to engage her mother in conversations that would prompt Catherine to ask the right questions. A 9-year-old asking curious questions about how the royal charities worked wouldn't raise suspicions, but it might plant seeds that would lead her mother to dig deeper. The plan began to unfold over the following month. Charlotte started asking her mother questions during their time together. "Mama, how do you know if a charity is really using donations the right way? Or, if someone was in charge of a lot of money, how would people know if they were being honest about how they spent it?" Catherine responded to these questions thoughtfully, and Charlotte could see her mother's investigative instincts being awakened. Soon, Catherine was asking more probing questions in her official meetings, and requesting access to more detailed financial records, and politely refusing to be satisfied with vague explanations. Meanwhile, David ensured that certain reports containing financial discrepancies landed on Catherine's desk through official channels. Margaret's carefully placed comments to other staff members created a buzz of concern that eventually reached the Princess of Wales through her lady-in-waiting. And Officer Thornton made sure that Catherine had opportunities to speak with staff members who had been affected by the purges of anyone questioning Camilla's authority. The turning point came during a charity gala in November. Catherine had been reviewing the foundation accounts in preparation for her speech and had noticed significant irregularities that couldn't be explained away. She confronted the foundation's director, a man named Gerald Hastings, who was known to be closely allied with Camilla. Charlotte wasn't present for this confrontation, but Officer Thornton was providing security and later shared what had happened. Catherine had calmly but firmly demanded to see the complete records for several questionable transactions. Hastings had tried to deflect, suggesting that these were complicated financial matters that didn't require her attention to detail. Catherine had responded by pointing out specific irregularities in dates, amounts, and authorizations that proved she had been doing her homework. Faced with Catherine's thorough knowledge and unwavering insistence, Hastings had made a fatal mistake. He had become defensive and mentioned that all of these transfers had been personally approved by the Queen Consort, suggesting that questioning them was tantamount to questioning Camilla's judgment. This confirmed what Catherine had suspected, that the financial irregularities weren't just administrative errors, but part of a coordinated pattern involving the highest levels of the household. That evening, Catherine had returned to Kensington Palace and immediately sought out Prince William. Charlotte, who had been waiting anxiously for any news, heard her parents talking late into the night in her father's study. The next morning, both of her parents looked exhausted but determined. Something had shifted. The investigation had moved from suspicion to certainty. And now the question was what to do with that certainty. Charlotte knew that the situation was approaching a critical point. Her step-grandmother's schemes were being exposed, but exposure was just the first step. What came next would determine not just the fate of the people involved, but potentially the stability of the monarchy itself. And somehow, she, a 9-year-old princess who had simply stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time, had become a key witness to it all.